Good evening and welcome to the 156th monthly meeting of FOSWELL. And for all the new people on the call, FOSWELL stands for Friends on Same Wavelength. Very briefly, it was started about 20 years ago in Cupertino, California. It was founded by a former engineer-in-chief of the then erstwhile Andhra Pradesh, Mr. M.L. Swamy. And the Hyderabad chapter, of which Mr. Venkateswara Rao Tipirneni is the founder president, he is on the call, was started in 2009. It's mainly a forum for senior citizens, and we organize monthly meetings on the third Saturday of the month. FOSWELL Hyderabad. We have chapters elsewhere, and we have our FOSWELlians from other chapters also on this call. And this meeting, I'm particularly delighted to share with all of you, marks the completion of 13 years of FOSWELL Hyderabad. Today's meeting marks that landmark. And we are looking forward to the 14th year. And what better way than to end it with a talk from such a celebrated person as Dr. Matthew Verghese. And you'll hear more about him from Dr. Vivekananda shortly. But before that, I just wanted to share with you how delighted we are to see all of you. And on behalf of the president and the members of the executive committee of Hyderabad chapter of FOSWELL, I'd like to say thank you to all our members, all our patrons, our supporters, all of you who have set up endowments in the names of your dear ones, in whose name every month's lecture is dedicated to recall their life and work, to all our logistics sponsors, and most importantly, to the several distinguished speakers who have given us their time generously in the last 13 years. If FOSWELL Hyderabad has come to be known for quality discourse and discussion and debate, it is entirely due to the generosity of our distinguished speakers in every single meeting. We have had them from far and wide on a variety of subjects, be it science, astronomy, geography, mathematics, psychology, psychiatry, homeopathy, education, geopolitical situation. Former RBI governors addressed us, ambassadors addressed us, you name it. We have had a very wide spectrum of topics and speakers. We are very fortunate to have had them, and FOSWELL Hyderabad wishes to acknowledge and thank each one of our speakers, distinguished speakers in the last 13 years. And in a way, having Dr. Matthew Verghese represents the iconic image of FOSWELL Hyderabad. He represents that, he epitomizes that. So thank you to each one who's on this call, and to all those who are not on this call but have been with us and have walked with us in this journey. May I now call upon a young engineering student, Deekshita, to read the prayer to commence our meeting.
Yes.
Go ahead, Deekshita.
So, good evening, one and all. My name is Deekshita, and I'm here to tell the prayer. Heaven of freedom, where the mind is without fear and head is held high, where the knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless strivings stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear streams of region has not lost its way into the dairy desert sands of death habits, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-winding thoughts and actions. Into the heaven of freedom, my father led my country awake. Thank you.
Thank you, Dikshita. Dikshita is a first-year engineering student. She's doing your electronics and communications, right? Or is it computer science?
Electrical and electronics.
Electrical and electronics. Very good. Wish you good luck.
Thank you, sir.
This month's lecture is an endowment lecture in the name of an illustrious person, Sri Pokala Nagendra Rao, a dedicated mechanical engineer who contributed to nation building. We have, at least I recognize 3 of his family members here. Prakash Rao, of course, Pokala is well known to us. He is Mr. M.L. Swami's son-in-law. And then 2 of his siblings have joined us from San Diego and Dallas. So Sairam, his son from Dallas, has agreed to say a few words about Mr. Nagendra Rao Pokala. Sairam, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I'm Sairam Pokala. I'm an IT engineer. I'm a software engineer in Dallas, Texas. I'm going to say a few words about my dad, Pokala Nagendra Rao Garu. He was born in 1926 in Nellore. He's from Nellore. And he did his engineering at Annamalai University in Tamil Nadu. Now it's in Tamil Nadu. Then he joined AP as AP government as a junior engineer, as a mechanical engineer. And he has worked through all the positions, assistant engineer, and then executive engineer, and retired as a superintendent engineer. The memories, I'm the youngest son of in the family, and he treated me so well. When I lost him, I lost one of my best friends, actually the best friend in my life. He is very calm. He was very calm, and he was always working, like 7/24 for the government. He wanted to help people. One of the memories I had was in Srikakulam. I went with him, as I was on, off school, and he was walking down to one of the villages. There, the people were building their own canal. He was really moved to see the dedication of the people, so he immediately tried to help, the way he can. He was a wonderful person. I'm still talking as if he exists now. In my memory, he's always with me, and he's one of the most important persons in my life, besides my other brothers. And I'm glad to join this meeting and express my feelings about him.
Thank you, Sairam. This is actually the 9th annual endowment lecture. So every year we remember him, we cherish his memory and his life's work. Prakash Rao Garu, would you like to say something too?
Not at this time, I think.
Okay.
My
Thank
brother
you.
already spoke. So another brother of mine is also going to join from Texas. I'll just check on him.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. This meeting is also supported. I don't know if Mr. Shiv Sharma, have you joined us? This meeting is supported by him in the name of his grandson. So maybe if he joins us later, we will speak a bit. He will tell us a little bit about him. So the moment we are all eagerly waiting for to listen to the celebrated Dr. Matthew Verghese. To know a bit more about him before he delivers his talk, I call upon another young orthopedician, Dr. Vivekananda Bhimishetty, to tell us the person behind this celebrity, Dr. Matthew Verghese. Vicky, your floor.
Yeah. Good evening, one and all. President of Fossil Hyderabad, Sri Venkateshwar Rao Garu, Dr. Verghese, ladies and gentlemen. In a world of billions, it is rare to know a person as passionate and as dedicated to the betterment of humanity as Dr. Matthew Verghese, a distinguished alumnus of Maulana Azad Medical College, New Delhi. Dr. Matthew Verghese is head of the Department of Orthopedic Surgery, St. Stephen's Hospital in Delhi. When he was director of the hospital earlier, he changed its profile to that of a super specialty tertiary care center and ran a large community outreach program that aided thousands of people. Dr. Verghese is the Honorable Medical Director of Cure International India and the chair of the largest clubfoot program in the world, leading the efforts of the NGO Clubfoot India Initiative Trust, which has treated nearly 76,000 children since 2009. He taught nearly 4,000 medical professionals like me the details of Ponseti technique, which is the best proven method of treating clubfoot disorders. Dr. Verghese is globally renowned for his contribution in rehabilitation of polio victims and is the Regional Technical Advisor for Disability and also the Regional Technical Advisor for Road Safety at the Southeast Asia Regional Office of the WHO. A thorough expert on injury control, epidemiology of injuries, pre-hospital care, and emergency care of trauma patients, Dr. Verghese has specialized in trauma care with particular emphasis on reconstructive surgery for trauma and deformities in adult and pediatric patients. His book, When Someone is Hurt, is a first aid guide that has been translated into 5 different languages, while his other book, Pre-Hospital Trauma Care Systems, filled with invaluable knowledge, was even published by the WHO. An incredible professional, Dr. Verghese is an associate faculty member at the Transportation Research and Injury Prevention Program, a WHO collaboration center at the Indian Institute of Technology, New Delhi, while also serving as a member of the Technical Committee on Trauma and Emergency Care Services at the WHO headquarters, Geneva. He is also the chair of the Project Review Committee on Trauma Care of the Indian Council for Medical Research. Dr. Verghese is the recipient of countless awards and accolades that firmly underscore his invaluable importance to the field of medicine. He received the Award of Honor for Reconstructive Surgery in Polio Patients in 1996, the National Award for Excellence in Medicine by the T.P. Junjunwala Foundation for the year 2004-2005, and the Distinguished Alumnus Award in 2007 by the Maulana Azad Medical College in recognition of his immense services to the medical field. On a personal note, I had the pleasure of attending one of Dr. Verghese's lectures around 2014-15 when he had visited Nizam's Institute of Medical Sciences in Hyderabad. While it goes without saying that the lecture was incredibly informative, what caught my ear the most was the passion with which Dr. Verghese spoke. It was a reiteration that the best doctors are the ones who truly care, who are truly dedicated, and are willing to go to their farthest reaches for the sake of their patients. Dr. Verghese has indubitably served as an inspiration for me personally since then. And yet, I'm not the only one to cite Dr. Verghese as an inspiration. He was named by Bill Gates as one of the 5 living heroes of the world who have inspired him and was described as an inspiration and a real-life hero for fighting and having dedicated his life for polio eradication in India. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further delay, I present to you Dr. Matthew Verghese, our very distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Vicky. That was a very nice introduction. Dr. Verghese, the floor is yours. If you wish to share the screen, you may do so now.
Is it visible?
Yes, yes, we can see your screen. Yes.
I make it the full screen. Okay.
Yes.
Good evening and good morning, everyone. it's truly embarrassing to be sitting and listening to your praise. But I'm truly honored and humbled by all that has been said. Some of that is outdated, but the fact remains that I'm truly embarrassed by the accolades that have been showered on me. Thank you very much. When Subbarao called me up and sent me a message that he would like me to be the speaker for this, I said, yes, okay. That quite some time back. I thought I have enough time, I'll prepare. And time flies, and he kept chasing me for again topics. And with much reflection, I thought maybe on COVID. He said, okay, reflections on the pandemic, the scientific, ethical, and human dimension was the title, which he said, you must speak on COVID. We want you to speak on COVID because we saw your videos on COVID. I'm not a physician, but to be engaged with COVID in the manner that I've got engaged has been a journey. And the journey is now more than 2 years old. In the November issue of Nature, there was an article on a new virus in Wuhan, China. And it's a weekly peer-reviewed journal, scientific journal, with the highest impact factor among scientific journals. And I follow it closely, and I was truly excited by this new virus, which is suddenly affecting people in Wuhan, and many of them dying, especially healthcare workers. And that is what caught my attention. And over the next few weeks, I followed the course of the virus in Wuhan and the reports that happened on the virus, and how within a span of 2 months, the entire genomic sequence of the virus was identified and put out for public view, so that the scientific community around the world could use it to develop further interventions, vaccines, or what have you. And that is a fascinating achievement of science. When you look at the worldometer, and this beginning was a very slow beginning, but it soon became explosive. The beginnings were declared a pandemic on March 11th by WHO, and it soon became explosive. But the interesting part was the way it progressed around the world has varied in terms of people affected, in terms of mortality, in terms of the course of the disease, and in terms of the way the spread has been happening and the deaths. Globally, the worldometer is something which people look at regularly. This is a slide from there. 273 million people have been affected, and 5.3 million people have died from this. The recovery statistics is a very good statistics for the politician, but it has no meaning as far as a scientific medical professional is concerned. Because if your mortality statistics is somewhere as low as 5.3 million out of 273 million, your recovery statistics has to be the rest of the numbers. The waves that have followed this epidemic have been fascinating, and any scientist would be impressed by analysis of this way, how it progresses, how it descends, and how it has been spreading in nations in different time spaces. My journey started soon after the lockdown. The readings went on, but the actual journey in understanding the human impact of this, when I started seeing patients that were affected. And that happened sometime in May, June, after the lockdowns were started. And then when we started hearing about the deaths, and you can see the waves in the deaths also. The numbers have been varying in the months. And from November 2019, now we have crossed November 2021. 2 years have gone by, and we are still grappling with what to do. India stands at number 2 with the number of new cases that are there and the number of deaths that are there in the per million population, much better than many parts of the world. For example, our deaths in India as today's table, 341 deaths per million compared to 2,400 deaths per million in the US, and compared to 2,800 deaths per million in a country like Brazil, and the UK 2,150. So the numbers have been varying. We have the Indian statistics of 34.7 million people affected, with 477,000 people who have died from this. The burden of death for a family is huge. The human cost of this tragedy is huge. And I'll tell 3 stories, which tells the human component of this whole story. That of a disabled child whom I had been treating. 2:30 in the morning, I get a call. Dr. Uncle, save my mother. I wake up, fully alert now. I recognize the name and I listen to the voice again. Dr. Uncle, save my mother. He said that in Hindi. I'm translating it and speaking. And in the background, I could hear a voice. Mama, please take breath. Mama, please take breath. Mama, try to lie on your tummy. So that conversation is the background. In the foreground is this girl pleading. And I immediately asked, do you have oxygen? No, the last cylinder is finishing. We don't have any more oxygen. I said, okay. You think you can call an ambulance? So we tried calling an ambulance, it's not available. Okay, put her in a car and bring her to the hospital. But there is no bed there, I know that. And while you wait there, in the casualty, they'll tell you to go to some other hospital. Don't go, stay there. While you stay there might be a bed that I can create for you. As luck would have it, while she was there, somebody died, a bed was created, and she was admitted. But down the line, she died. I couldn't save that mother. The disabled child was distraught. The statistics that I shared with you does not grasp the degree of suffering that that family went through. The next story is that of a pregnant lady. Again came for admission, requesting for a bed. There was no bed. She was in an ambulance. And the ambulance driver said, we will need to get her admitted because I'm running out of ambulance oxygen supply. So they kept pleading the hospital. They called me up. I called up my hospital. They said, we have nothing available for admitting this lady because she needs oxygen. Her saturation is going down to 86%. Without oxygen, she will need ICU bed. There is no ICU bed. She will need to go to an ICU bed. The family then plead with the ambulance driver, somehow managed to get an oxygen cylinder and shift her to a neighboring town 100 kilometers away because someone promised them an ICU bed. This pregnant lady, 8 months pregnant, gets admission in the ICU. By the time she reaches, she needs a ventilator, and the next day she's dead. Mother and child both dies. Again, a sad story. The third story is that of a blind couple. I got a phone call requesting that their mother and father both are unwell and they need admission for the mother. I then use my contacts in a medical college, plead with the doctor that this patient needs admission, but the couple is scared of handling the process of admission from the casualty to the place, and they'll need help. So can you arrange for help? So my friend who was there in the medical college in Maulana Azad Medical College, very helpful. He talked to the administrators, he arranged a bed, everything was done. By then, this couple had decided that there is no point now, even if she's taken and admitted, she'll be lonely, and therefore it is not worth the effort of letting her be alone in her last moment of life. So they wanted to stay with her while she's breathing her last. And that is what they did. They chose, despite the fact that I could arrange a bed, the fact that the family chose to keep her within their home and be with their mother till she breathed her last. These are stories after stories after stories, which I went through during the COVID waves that happened. The first wave and then the second wave. Each story taught me something. Each story moved me, and each story stimulated me to action, to think and understand the disease more and in a better way. Each story should stimulate us to action for future. And I think we need to do that. We need to do that as individuals. We need to do that as a society. We need to do that as a community. But how do we act? What are the societal mechanisms in decision-making process? That needs to be understood. And any action that you take should be based on analysis of facts, provided you have facts. Analysis of science, provided your science is right. Analysis of impact of the intended action, provided you know what level is the impact happening because of what action you have done. And then, was your action ethical, or did it compromise the ethics of human existence? And also, how do our actions impact humanity at large? So that in future, sometime in history, how would humanity be judged in this phase of time? That is something that we need to understand and analyze. COVID-19 has impacted societies globally. Controversies have been agog on all aspects of the pandemic, be it the prevention, the diagnosis, the treatment, the follow-up, the rehabilitation, and the long-term impact also. We are in the process. The controversies abound in the science. The origin of the virus, there is no resolution on that political dimension as yet. Is it deliberately created? Is it natural? Is it zoonotic, jumping from one species to another? No clarity on that. The CDC itself, the mecca of public health. You want to look at a reference on public health, you look at what does CDC say on this, because they have to be right. The early reports were, there is no aerosol spread. And then they said, there is aerosol spread. Then the prevention, early reported there's no role of public masks. Then the revised revision, there is a role of public masks. And if you look at public health interventions for public health disasters or epidemics or pandemics, it only talks about quarantine. But there's no talk about lockdown. So there was this issue about lockdown versus no lockdown. And then now, of course, we have the Omicron, travel ban versus no travel ban in the current situation. That was there in the earlier phase also, but in the current situations. And then if you look at the symptoms chronology as the strains evolved, 1, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, the Omicron, all of them have varying degrees of transmissibility, of infectivity, and seriousness that they produce. The classic description was majority have only mild symptoms, or about a third of them have no symptoms. That's there. But there is about 20% that can have a severe disease, and about 5% critical disease, and about 2.odd% varying from different communities and different demographic categories, different levels of mortality. But what is it that makes this 20% different from that 80%? We're still groping to understand the signs of it. Early reports were comorbidities, age, hypertension, diabetes, coronary artery disease, immune compromised, obesity. All these together or individually have been described as a higher probability of mortality. But we still do not know any number of diabetic. No, I had diabetes, I have hypertension, I have coronary artery disease, I have obesity, but nothing has happened to me. I had no symptoms. And on the other side, one well-controlled diabetic within 2 weeks is gone. We don't know. There is evaluation among families also. Genome-wide association studies is one group of studies which looks at, are there genetic associations between different outcomes of a disease? And they found that there are some strong statistical association with families with the same genetic. So in the same family, twin brothers are affected more seriously. Brothers are affected more seriously. The parents and the sons are affected, but the in-laws are not affected with that level of seriousness. So we still do not know for a certainty why some people have serious disease. We have hypotheses, but no scientific clarity on this as yet. The clinical management have been widely varying with all kinds of claims and counterclaims, from immunity boosters to antibiotics to antivirals to repurposed drugs and immunomodulators, anticoagulants, you name it. But the key approach has been trying to target the virus, trying to moderate the host response, trying to modulate the host response, and giving adjunctive therapy. Of these, all of you would be familiar with all these details from all that you have been hearing and reading so far. But only two things have withstood the time test across various strains that have come up. These are usually dexamethasone or the steroids, but the timing is critical. and the anticoagulants. The antibodies, the monoclonal antibodies, have been presented both individually or as cocktails, and they have been pushed. We still are trying to understand what is the best timing, what is the best approach. We have a lot of research on this, but no clear guideline forming research. Remember, when you make a guideline, you don't make it on a simple one study. You make a guideline on a body of evidence that is generated from multiple researchers, because the key thing in science is the reproducibility of an action that you have proposed for hypothesis, and you have proven it by a particular action. And if that hypothesis is again done by somebody else and tested, it should also have the same results. That is the robustness of sound science, repeatability of that evidence. And then there is understanding of clotting. The whole concept of pneumonias as the cause of death in COVID-19 was the first flaw that happened in clinical judgment. Until that Italian doctor in Lombardy, that pathologist, retired pathologist, not even an active pathologist, retired pathologist, did investigations on the lung tissue and found that it is not pneumonia at all. It is clotting of blood. And that is what led to this hypothesis of giving anticoagulants as an adjunct therapy for these patients. And now it seems to be a standard of care for a lot of patients in that group which show these signs. The early guidelines were empirical, understandably so. We had no research. There have been a plethora of papers. There have been a plethora of poor quality research because the clinicians were so busy doing clinical work, because the health systems were overwhelmed. You can understand their inability to produce quality research, quality evidence, and also the systems in place locally, nationally, and globally were not built in for real-time analysis of data. And therefore, there was a lack of real-time development of protocols. There was a plethora of advisors, therefore, and the plethora of advisors were further amplified, and confounding messages were being given to the layperson. So the common man had no clue on what needs to be done. He only had fear, and panic prevailed across nations. In our own country, for example, the AIIMS ICMR protocol, based on the evidence, they created a set of protocols. Fair enough. But the problem was this protocol was there for many months. It needed to be remodified. They remodified, they created a next version. But then this was not what was needed in time, frozen for 1 or 2 periods. It needed to be dynamically evolving. For example, when the second wave happened, what was problematic was testing. And in the testing, admission was based on a person being tested positive for COVID-19, the Delta variant. 1/3 of the Delta variants escaped the RT-PCR being done at that period. So if you were not RT-PCR positive, then you could not be admitted into a COVID ward. So there were patients with all the symptoms, but their RT-PCR was negative, so they were denied admission. And that was something which was very difficult to comprehend. So if this was dynamic and real time, we would not have had that kind of a situation. We would have understood that 1/3 of the RT-PCR is negative, and therefore, if the symptom complex fits in and the patient has the physical signs and the symptoms, he can be admitted. That didn't happen. That needed to happen. But that's a lesson that we need to. So we have Omicron now, for example, and fortunately, the tests are getting positive in the normal regular test, except for a small group of the S genome variety where there is some difference there, but they are able to identify. But then can you identify all of them? Unless you sample them specifically for Omicron, you will not get the diagnosis. So is it practical to sample all of them? So countries have been sampling different levels at different times. 0.25% of the total RT-PCR positive was subjected to, for example, in a neighboring country. I'm not naming it. 0.5% in many of our labs. So all of them are not subjected to Omicron evaluation. So if the number of test positivity is low, possibly we should think of doing it for all patients so that we know what's happening in our community. And it is because I went through these crises, because I was following up these patients and I was talking to these patients, I got an understanding on patients were confused and they were pleading for help. Tell us what to do. And the digital sensors, again, the science of the digital sensors, this were used as a management tool for decision making for admissions into hospitals, not just in UK or US, even in India that was being recommended. The protocol had that is one way, or the 6-minute walking test. So you had all that looking at the digital sensor and the oxygen. But if you look at the pulse oxygen digital sensors itself, there are papers abound which tell that the values may be flawed in a colored person. The values may be flawed in a person with a thick skin. The values may be flawed for other reasons also. So then how do you make a decision? So we need to get our sciences right. People needed to be guided, and that is what created confusion. And confusion meant that people were following everything and everybody that they heard from, whatever they could do. So they were taking all kinds of drugs. So once they heard that steroids could help, they started taking steroids right on the first day of their first symptom, which is dangerous. Because only prolong the viral multiplication, prolong the viral positivity in them, and of course, maybe also encourage the mutations because the virus survived, multiplied longer, and had the opportunity to mutate. The timeline-based management was clearly based on how you can decide based on your first symptom. In the first wave, everybody knew when they got infected. But in the second wave, nobody had a clue. No, we never went anywhere. We had the symptom. We never went anywhere. We had the symptom only, and that is it. We don't know. But from there, if you count down, average 5 days was the time when the viral based symptoms would subside. After that, what has happened was purely only in those critically ill patients who became critically ill, who became severe in their symptoms. And these are the ones who were shown to have a cytokine storm and coagulation problem in their lungs and blood vessels. So this understanding based on readings, based on talking of patients, their symptoms, helped guide many patients. In fact, I guided almost 400 patients on how to, not that I was treating them alone. They were in touch with their physicians, but I guided them, okay, you're going to be clear, don't worry. Oh, you're so right, doctor. So that helped. But we still don't know why there are such differences across countries, such wide differences. And there have been papers abounding on hypotheses for this. For example, this paper looks at the statistics on testing and death. So many people say that if you tested more, that should have been there. So many epidemiologists have been thinking, we should have tested more. But believe me, any number of testing alone is not going to help. You need to have other protocols and guidelines also in place. USA had 1,866 deaths per million in the earlier phase, and now over 2,000 deaths per million in the current phase. India, we moved from 288 to 300 odd million deaths. The number of tests that we did are a very small number compared to what the American and the British statistics were. Again, when we looked at the OECD countries, this is a slightly older paper, OECD countries again, the beds per population were the highest in Germany. The mortality per population was the lowest in Germany. Italy had the second lowest number among this group of countries, 3.2 beds per thousand population, but they had the highest death. You know why? One of the hypotheses is the privatization of primary healthcare. Lombardy was the epicenter of the worst affected cases in Italy. And there, privatization of healthcare, including primary healthcare, has been going on for many years. And this is clearly shown as one way the community level care was completely wiped out, and therefore it happened. But we still don't know how China has managed so well. Their numbers continue to be low even today. But among the healthcare professionals, other than the early cases in Wuhan, the rest of the healthcare professionals that have been infected have been practically zero. And I've been trying to analyze this. There has to be a science behind this. So when I talk to my friends there, case after case after case, when I try to look at things here and I try to look at things there, what have they done differently? So my friends in Hong Kong, they told me that wherever a COVID patient is admitted in a negative air pressure area, with more than 12 air changes per hour. That's the standard of care for COVID patients, the environment in which the COVID patient is kept. And that ensures that no healthcare worker gets infected. Whereas in most countries, when I spoke to my friends in the UK, for example, I asked my friends, has anybody in the ICU died? They said, no. Has anybody in the intensive care unit intensivist died? No. When I said healthcare worker, ICU staff that have died, they said no. Have anesthetists been part of the mortality statistics? They said no. Who have died? They have had physicians dying, they have had primary care people dying, they have had general gastroenterologists and other specialties roped in for care in non-ICU areas that died. Why? Two reasons. One, hypothesis needs to be tested out. Possible reasons. One, by the time they reach ICU, they are no longer excreting living viruses. Number one, because they're already 2 weeks down the line. By then, there are no living viruses that they're excreting. But second most important reason, all ICUs are negative care areas, negative pressure areas. And therefore, the patient infecting the doctor is probably very low. The other wards that are refurbished as COVID care areas did not have negative pressure, did not have that number of air changes per hour. And therefore, their mortality among the healthcare workers and infective rates among the healthcare workers were higher. So it's remarkable how China did it. China did it how? Because from their SARS-1 experience, from their H1N1 experience, they have this protocol across all hospitals in China. That's a remarkable thing. We need to learn from that. I think there is a need for sharing of information. We should not dismiss things as cynically, no, their data is not valid. Their data is not reliable. I think we need to understand clearly, can we look at things intelligently and openly? Vaccines, again, remarkable achievement scientifically that in such a short time you have so many varieties of vaccines. But the controversies have been dogging the whole process. Why? Because the dosage intervals, because can we interchange one vaccine with the other? When should we give the booster? Should we give the booster? When, third booster should be given to all. Efficacy against variants, are they effective against Delta? Are they effective against Omicron now? And most important thing, when you talk about equity becomes a big issue if most people in the world have not received the vaccine, and high-income countries and preferential where vaccines is available, you make the third booster dose available. That is a huge equity issue. Any number of platforms are there. I'll not go into details of that, but important things to understand. We've been lucky in India to have the two key vaccines, Covaxin and Covishield. The others are still there. Sputnik is available. The only difference between Sputnik and Oxford in terms of platform design is both use adenoviruses, but Sputnik uses one variety of adenovirus for the first dose and the second variety of adenovirus for the second dose, hoping that probably you have a better immune response, thinking that two viral vectors are better than one. That clearly shows us we need to understand the science. Is that so? Should we have it for other vaccines also? We need to understand the science in a better way. Pregnancy and vaccines, the ethical issues are huge. Can we do trials? Because we're not dealing with one human being, we're dealing with two human beings. It is sheer serendipity that many people that had the vaccine shots became pregnant and therefore, or didn't know they were pregnant and ended up with this situation that we could check the safety, and they have found that reasonably safe. Then the variants. Delta was a variant of concern, soon became a dominant variant globally. This was how it was because transmissibility was high. In the second wave, almost predominantly, huge contagiousness, huge spread. Today, the world is talking about the Omicron variant. So I thought my lecture would be probably out of date, out of time, and not at all relevant to the population because by now the COVID would be on the backdrop of most nations with vaccines coming up in a big way. Suddenly you have Omicron and we do not know. November 24th, just see 2 years down the line from the first virus, you have the variant that has come up, variant B1.1.529, a variant of concern described by WHO. Why is it a variant of concern? Because of the number of mutations. The vaccines are developed based on specific components of the virus. And if this specific component against which the vaccine is developed to identify that particular pathogen, then you could have a problem if number of mutations are high. This particular virus, Omicron virus, is supposed to have 49 mutations. And of the 49 mutations, you have almost 32 of them relating to the spike protein, and most vaccines target the spike protein as the most recognizable USP of a virus to target the virus as soon as it enters the body to create neutralizing antibodies. So this is something that we need to understand. So this is 49 mutations is a huge jump from 13 mutations found in the Delta variant. So Delta variant also, the effectiveness of the vaccines have been found to be low. So the problem is when you're in a pandemic situation, how do you generate your scientific evidence in such a situation? It's a challenge. It's not easy. It's difficult. But remember, people say that, that it is, mutated. So therefore you'll have, but mutations and variations are part of evolution. They have been happening from the time of creation of life. And these will continue and new variants will keep appearing. We have the influenza virus. The influenza virus, the 2018 virus, many of you may not know this. The 2018 virus has been recreated in the lab and reinfected in experimental animals to check the impact of this virus, the influenza virus. Fascinating science, they have done that. They've recreated it and tested it out. And when they test it out, it turns out that the probability of this virus mutating is also there, and it will continue to evolve. The influenza virus of today is evolving very frequently, and therefore you need to create newer vaccines every time. So this may be a reality. We don't know. We're still trying to understand. Fortunately, the science tells us that giving these shots has helped people that have infected have been protected, and therefore the probability of the protection is there. But will the Omicron, which is more contagious than the Delta variant in the preliminary reports that are there, for example, in South Africa, in communities, it has been spreading in a large way. But why is it spreading so much? And in fact, even in Europe, where the numbers are there, but fortunately, it is a mild disease. So will the spike of such an Omicron virus be as steep as the one that you see here? And my understanding is that with such a large population being immunized in some countries, and with such a large population being infected in some countries, the susceptible, exposed, infected numbers cannot go steeper than this curve. It's almost 85-degree gradient, and that's what I've been talking about. So the duration of the curve depends on the steepness of the spike. And if you see the steepness of the spike, the ascent is like the descent. And all engineers and all scientists know that if you have a curve which is symmetrical, then you know that the curve has gone up naturally, it has come down naturally. If you've done an artificial input to that curve, then there'll be a bump or a spike, either of the two, or a depression. Something has to happen, or the descent curve will have a different gradient than the ascent curve. Something has to happen. So this is what we need to understand. So we look at the waves, yes, and panic. And we do modeling studies, but modeling studies are based on epidemiological data, the susceptible, infected, recovered data of the previous viruses. Our understanding of Omicron is still evolving. Until the epidemic has infected a large population and herd immunity is achieved, we still are groping. Is herd immunity at 60%, 70%, or 90%? So in communities that have 90% infection and or vaccination, then should an Omicron variant be infected? Should we have a booster dose? That's the question which is troubling everyone. And they want to know, by mathematical modeling experts, can we know whether it is going to come or not? But then remember, natural processes are not always predictable. There's a level of inherent unpredictability on this. And nature is neither deterministic nor stochastic, because it doesn't go the probability science way. And therefore, when everything depends on everything else, we will have unpredictability. So we have to remain open-minded on predictions. While we prepare for the worst, we hope for the best. So how do we prepare? What do we understand? Are children to be vaccinated also? So the other day I was reading an editorial in one of the most popular newspapers in India. And the editorial said that the decision has to be made at the policy level for vaccinating children. But remember, we need to understand that children have mild disease, but they can spread the disease to the grandparents who are very vulnerable. So that is a concern. So we should probably vaccinate children. But why this hesitancy of policymakers should also be understood, because policymakers are guided by some scientists, and some scientists are worried that children should be safe when they are given the vaccine. Because remember, vaccines are given not to infected like drugs given to treat a patient. Vaccines are given to normal human beings. And these normal human beings cannot have any complication from this. And there are reports that with even the second dose of some of the Pfizer Moderna group, the children are having myocarditis. So people are apprehensive. So until the science is robust enough to talk about proven safety, despite the proportions of children, even in a nation like Israel, when you look at it, the population of children affected are more than the others, despite a very high vaccination rate. So this brings us to the issue about schools. The schools are an issue in all the countries. I was just speaking just before the meeting. I got a message from one of my friends in Denmark. She's down with COVID, and one of the reasons we ascribe that is to schools reopening and children carrying the infection. But we don't know that. Do children infect others as much as that? That has not been proven in some of the studies in Switzerland, some of the researchers among the school relatives that are there. On the other side, we still do have that. So we are still evolving in our understanding of epidemiology of this whole disease process. And bulk of the literature on transmission suggests that kids aren't driving the viral spread. So maybe there is a logic in opening schools. Maybe there is, and we should open schools. Why? Because 2 years of cognitive deficiency for these kids by the school inputs that are there. 2 is not a small number of years, it's a long time. So maybe 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, we'll know the true impact of this bunch of kids that lost 2 years of cognitive development in schools. And that is a serious subject for research, long-term research. So while we recognize the science, it seems rational that we don't want long-term impacts. We do take care of precautions. While many communities have open schools, we also have open schools in India, but we need to understand that. We need to study that. And long COVID also needs to be studied at length because symptoms can last weeks or months, and we are still studying that and getting 10 to 30% of those are still experiencing symptoms of long COVID. And cloudy thinking and foggy brain. We don't know the reasons for it, but there are only hypotheses. But what is the duration for which this can happen? What are the causes of it? And what are the causes of some of the first symptoms that happen? For example, anosmia. Most people that I've spoken to did not realize this. 2 fields where anosmia can be impacted. Some of it may be long-term. Security workers who have had COVID, who have had anosmia, may not. Most of them also are guards during the night where there could be a fire risk. And if there is a fire risk and there is no fire alarm, the first alarm that you have is in your olfactory senses, your sense of smell. You smell smoke and you look for fire. Sorry, am I muted?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
So these people will not be able to recognize a fire when it is happening. Again, we smell food as good food or bad food from the smell. So many of these cooks and chefs may not be able to recognize that. So that's what we need to understand. So are we going to have an endemic part of the disease? Maybe the future will be endemic. But there are ethical dilemmas that have been grappling with. How do we decide who lives and who dies? In ethical issues, we look at autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. That means do no harm. Beneficence is trying to do some good. Justice is being just across the board. So the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly shown that we have not been able to do an egalitarian, equitable, just distribution of resources. So, for example, when a COVID patient has had a cardiac arrest, there are complications that can be risk to the healthcare worker. So there are end-of-life care decisions that are done. If you look at this table, end-of-life decisions where resources are available, healthcare worker is available, the physician wants to do a resuscitation, patient wishes and the relative wish of resuscitation, then it is okay. But if the resources are not available, then it becomes a real ethical challenge. And that's what happened in many ICUs. Also, they had to choose to ventilate whom. So they started ventilating the younger. They started ventilating the longer life probability persons. The patients have a negative right to refuse, but they do not have a positive right to demand it. The ethical issues also related to travel bans, vaccine passports, jab refusers, rights of admission into areas, rights to refuse isolation. So How do we decide on quarantine versus lockdown? These are ethical dimensions that we need to ponder on. Is it causing harm? Is the restriction of freedom causing harm or isolation causing harm? Especially multiply disabled persons that were isolated, they could be harmed. So I know many people who chose to stay at home and not to go to a hospital, though they needed hospitalization because of risk of isolation. So is restrictive means or coercive means are ethical? Which one is to be chosen? Societies need to take care of the people that are in quarantine so that they are not put to harm, they don't have any inconvenience. And all decisions have to be transparent. These are ethical guidelines for quarantine patients. This is a survey, which is an interesting survey, where the healthcare providers were asked, doctors and healthcare providers were asked, do you agree that people that do not behave responsibly should be denied prioritization for healthcare? And majority of them felt that yes, they should be denied. So there is an ethical dilemma here. Should they be denied because they are not behaving responsibly? How do you allocate resources, especially where resources are scarce? By a lottery, by waiting list, by sickest first, the youngest first, or by the maximum number of lives saved? And that is the tension that is always there in public health. Maximum number of lives saved is what you look at. And the prognosis of the disease, if he's not going to have a quality of life, should we save him? Instrumental value and reciprocity, all are components. And global justice significantly shapes local context now. We need to have urgent attention to this context because global justice, for example, South Africa reported the Omicron variant, but then you shoot the messenger by invoking travel ban on South Africa. So you're punishing them economically because their economy depends on tourism. Countries in southern tip of Africa depend hugely on tourism for their income. So their income depends on tourism. All those poor people that depend on tourism will be worse affected. So the whole concept of justice is gone. So you have ethics being affected there. So disparities have widened. Social impacts and economic impacts have made the humanitarian tragedy. I'm not highlighting the huge migration that happened in India, but I'm highlighting the human tragedy in terms of the economic impact, the social impact of isolation, and how it affected families catastrophically to the. But the infodemic has everyone confused. There is a clear need to foster people's understanding on science. People no longer are believing science, how scientific knowledge is produced and used. This is an opportunity for us to understand this. This is an opportunity for us to create systems, opportunity to build surge capacity for human resources, equipment, and infrastructure, opportunity to build public institutions for care, research, and manufacture, opportunity to build artificial intelligence and digital technology. But the problem is we've had a merger of real versus virtual, merger of science versus unscience, merger of truth and untruth, ethical and unethical, all merging together and losing identity. So these need to be clearly defined and understood. The infodemic and the social media has created this tension now. Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing but medicine on a larger scale, as told by Vercoe. So the medical doctor who is making a decision is also like a politician or an administrator who's making a decision, because both impact societies. And that is medicine on a larger scale. What is unique about this pandemic is not that the virus is unique. No, any number of viruses have been there, but the societal reaction to the virus has been unique. To use the title of a novel, Fear is the Key. This has been used by rulers. Fear is the key to drive decision making. That, to my mind, is unethical. You need to have transparently shared, stakeholder-driven decisions that are equitable and egalitarian. So we also need to understand what kind of knowledge, therefore, we should incorporate that generate that policy by politicians and administrators. That knowledge is created by a pluralism of epistemic understanding, pluralism of epistemic decision making in policy making. We need to put in that. We need to include social sciences, because only then the humanity would be involved in our decision making. Unless we have the humanity at a larger scale, and that understanding is possible only with social sciences. To penalize a victim who's got COVID, to stigmatize the victim who's got COVID, to stigmatize somebody who's refusing a jab, to stigmatize somebody who is refusing to have a surveillance application on his phone, is also something which has an ethical domain to it. So we need to understand how do we involve communities and societies, and that needs social science input. So policy making never really follows science in the very strict sense. There is always a matter of power, politics, regulatory constraints, and bureaucracy, and survival of the ideas that seems most plausible. So the most plausible reason was lockdown. So country after country started doing it. So we need to have a broader view of this policy making research, biological, social, political, environmental, dynamics of healthcare and interaction, human interaction, all based on research. But transparency is the key for ensuring public trust. Digital technology has been used for nudging public through communication, nudging public. But digital tech epidemiology tools are useful. But remember, they are the ethical dimensions of monitoring, of surveillance, of detection and stigma that goes with it, and all the prevention talk about jabs and isolation and lockdowns and masks and all those things that went with it. We need to understand people are suspicious. People are suspicious because they have lost confidence in the science, because science and unscience have merged, truth and untruth have merged, because ethical and unethical have merged together, because they don't trust the data that they're giving, the data that they're sharing, and the privacy that they have, so unique to their democratic right, is being, compromised. So we need to understand that. We need to have a system that responds rapidly, real-time response. In fact, you have evidence-based guideline has become a key buzzword in healthcare, evidence-based guideline. And from the 90s to 2000 today also. But the problem with guidelines that have been developed for COVID they have not been living guidelines. Now they are rethinking on that. Living guidelines, living evidences have been put in, because evidences are based on systematic research. Evidences are based on randomized controlled trials, and these take time to evolve and generate. But that could be fast forwarded by having living evidences and living guidelines. These should be built into our research protocols. For example, in Australia, they have done that, reviewing papers, and from something which took 3-4 years for generating a guideline is being fast forwarded to 3 months to even weeks now. That is what we need. So how can we overcome the divide? Only by having transparent, ethical, just decisions, and by reducing the divide between the academic community, the scientific community, and society at large. And then we have to think of that is the only way to create a just and reflective society. So maybe public intellectuals have a role, but there is no rule book that spells that public intellectuals should behave in this way and their voice should be heard, should not be heard, they should talk or not talk. We don't know. We need to look at how can we reestablish a compassionate society. We have been preoccupied with the microbiological, semiotic, and digital social network. We need to look at the future. Is the future going to be universal mask wearing? Is the future going to be only hand sanitizing and physical distancing? Which is not the future that we need to have. But then we need to look at research that is dynamically evolved and communicated, create protocols, and from what we can understand from the Italian experience and other impact of the pandemic in societies which have good public health infrastructure, we will never have overwhelming, the Kerala model, where they've never had the overwhelming nature of the epidemic because they managed to keep it under control. Universalizing healthcare to improve quality and reach and access is the only way forward to make sure that we win over this pandemic, whatever be the variant at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Verghese. That will require a moment to catch our breath after hearing so much of about the pandemic. So while I pose the first question, here is an opportunity for all of you to interact with Dr. Verghese. Please type in your questions into the chat box, and I will select a few and pose them to Dr. Verghese. Here's the first one, Dr. Verghese. You have dealt with the various dimensions in decision making and policy making and public policy in dealing with a pandemic of this nature. It is largely believed that Niti Aayog had a task force which was advising the government of India on the actions to be taken in dealing with COVID-19. In your opinion, how has India measured on these three dimensions that you described so well today? The scientific, ethical, and human aspects of the various decisions that were taken in the first and second wave?
Well, it's very difficult to really compare and give a scorecard on each of these components. The reason is that the outcome is what you need to look at. If you look at the mortality statistics, we have fared very well. But is the mortality statistics because of what we have done or because of a combination of factors which were beyond what we have done? So therefore, to scorecard it based on the outcome of mortality alone or the number of tests that we have done or what we have been able to achieve in terms of first the scientific, I think there has been a time lag. There has been a time lag between our guidelines and our interventions, which were needed on the ground. So therefore, there has been a drawback on that. That's very clear. But there are reasons for it because we have not built our systems for such a level of pandemic. So that's a lesson for us. So we have failed on that. At the policy level, I've always said this. Was a lockdown essential? Yes, perhaps, to flag the importance of the disease, to flag the importance of the pandemic, the contagiousness, to prepare our healthcare infrastructure, to do everything. Yes, but a continued lockdown? No, certainly not. Because people die from hunger more commonly than this. So we need to understand the impact of this on a larger social scale, long-term impact. So could we have prevented the overwhelming that happened in some of the cities and that was flooding the media? Yes, perhaps we could have. And there I would use the Kerala model. Kerala model was successful not because immediate thing that they did, because of long-term things that they did. Long-term thing that did was public health infrastructure in Kerala is robust and they have the lowest infant mortality rate in the country. And unless we understand that the public health infrastructure in Kerala is robust and therefore rest of the things. So doing one thing at one time, so even if the policymakers did the right thing, they could not have got the results because the healthcare infrastructure was not prepared for an overwhelming situation like this. So did they do a lot? Yes, they did a lot. But was that sufficient? No. Why? Because the preparation for their infrastructure development was not sufficient. Did they prepare themselves for the second wave sufficiently enough? Perhaps no. We could have done better. Could we have prevented the second wave? The impact could have been minimized further than what we have minimized.
There's a follow-on to this observation. If you recall, during the second wave, there was a lot of public hue and cry about the alleged insensitivity of the rulers or the ruling, the government, in allowing large congregations due to festivals and political campaigning. And there was a genuine widespread fear that it would trigger a very massive spread of the infection. Why did that not happen, Dr. Matthew?
That's an interesting epidemiological challenge to answer. One common sense thing that I can think of is all these gatherings were in the open air. They were in the open air. Remember what I said about infectivity? Negative pressure, 12 AH changes per hour.
Yeah.
None of the healthcare workers in China have got infected after Wuhan. None. So if you have an open air environment and you have even people, closer together, it doesn't really cause the spread. So we still need to understand the dynamics of the disease. And the reason the hue and cry was there because there were selective restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
So that is where the whole, you remember what I said about justice?
Right.
The moment you feel it has been not an equitable decision, justice comes into play. And the moment people feel that they have not had a just decision thrust on them, they will protest.
Mm-hmm.
So what was needed was the communication to prevent this. And what is needed was to make sure that it was a just and fair decision across board.
Yeah, that makes sense. Before I take up the next question, we have two attendees, Maria Isabel and Marie Friedberg. Would you tell us where you're joining us from? From the names, I find it. Can you hear me, Maria Isabel and yeah.
Hi,
Friedberg,
everyone.
Where are you joining us from?
I am from Denmark. I'm an orthopedic surgeon and I'm a friend of Matthew Verghese. I'm at the moment in my bed infected with COVID, so I'm happy to join you.
Very good. We're glad you joined. Thank you. And Maria Isabel?
Hi, how are you? No, congratulations, Matthew, for the wonderful conference. I am from Cali, Colombia, South America, and I enjoy very much the conference. I think it's very, very important to hear this, and I completely agree with all the points, including the ethical and sometimes the politician doesn't follow the basics of the epidemiology, and that's why we have this all around the world. So thank you, Matthew, and thank you for all the conference. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. The next question is, there's a doubt if yoga and pranayam can help build immunity, or what are the other steps to build immunity? And a related question is, it appears that the flu season coincides with the peak of this infection. And the example given is that the peak in Himachal is different from that in Maharashtra, and the peak in Europe is different than that in South Asia. Is there any pattern or a scientific evidence to this? And if so, do policy makers and public health officials take cognizance of this in designing their, plans to address this.
Yeah, in fact, there was this hypothesis that, when in India, I was following the early phase, when in India, we didn't have the phase in summers, because the virus is a very vulnerable virus to heat. Over 25 degrees Celsius, it doesn't survive. So it's a very vulnerable virus. So it was hypothesized that warm countries will be less affected than, cold countries. But that has not been proven so. So we don't understand the dynamics to make a statement across board like that. It has followed patterns of spread in different parts of the world differently. It has not truly followed the flu pattern. So if you look at the waves around the world, the waves have not really followed the flu pattern. They have not really followed the warm versus cold pattern, the north versus south pattern. No, it hasn't really followed that. So it's difficult. So by now in winters, the flu season is coming up and we should have a pandemic, an epidemic now. In India, the epidemic was May, June, summertime.
Right.
Where is flu time? Not at all.
Yeah. There is a widespread fear that the third wave will strike us soon. And this has been in the air for some time now. It was predicted to be in September, October. I mean, various people have given various, predictions or prophesized on it. Is there a chance of a third wave? And if so, would it be of the same magnitude as the first and second? I know it's in the realm of the unknown, smiling. And today I saw that we have given about 137 crore vaccines, doses of vaccine in India, about 80 odd crore, 85, 86 crore for the first dose, and about 55 roughly crore who have had 2 doses. So will the vaccination numbers help us in preventing or handling or a milder third wave?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I didn't dwell too much on that. I briefly commented on it. You see, that was why I talked about the modeling part. The modeling part has been done, and the mathematical modeling gurus modeled that there will be a third wave, which will be a little milder. It will happen in September, October. And I argued specifically that it will not happen. And you can look up my previous talks. And I specifically said it will not happen in September, October. I was very clear on that. I was very clear on that. Because among the 400 patients that I've been following up, I've had 3 patients who had repeat infection, who were COVID positive again. Out of 403, which means less than 1%. Right. Less than 1% is getting a repeat infection, and that too 1 year later. That too 1 year later. So if we had all the statistics across the country compiled, the government has that, data is there. Right. What we need is somebody who can analyze it intelligently, and that is what I am pushing for. This is what you need to do. Merely collecting data is not sufficient. It's not sufficient because, in fact, that is another lecture that I gave on. It is not sufficient. You need to analyze it intelligently, and that doesn't happen by individual efforts. There has to be institutions dedicated to do that and doing only that. Right. And the problem that has happened in the pandemic, there has been a failure there, I will say. The clinicians, they worked so hard. And I know my friends, all of them slogged day and night, petrified that they'll carry the infection back home. Petrified. They worked hard, but the researchers who were doing research were away from them. They didn't know the ground reality at the ground level, at the clinical level. So we needed to get them together. How do we get them together? How do we marry the clinical data with the research that and the analysis that is going on? Not sufficient enough, despite the large volume of data that is generated. The Indian Council of Medical Research has been gathering data, has been doing research piecemeal, but not at the level that was required in the pandemic because of the uncertainties that have been there. So to come back to that third wave, my guesstimate was it will not happen.
Mhm.
It will not happen on the scale that has happened in the second wave. There will be ripples in areas where people are susceptible who have not had the infection or you've not had the vaccination. Immunology is a relatively, it's very old science in terms of Edward Jenner's times when cowpox was used as a mode to prevent smallpox, because they found that these women who get these little blisters on their hands milking the cows, they did not get smallpox. So from that time, they knew that there's something to do with some resistance that happens to these people. We still are in the evolving phase. Everyone talks about the booster shot. Why? Because you are circulating antibodies, the antibodies which are called humoral antibodies medically in your bloodstream, which neutralizes any virus that enters your system as soon as it enters, is going down. But that is not the only level of immunity. The circulating humoral antibodies are responsible for neutralizing antibodies. But your immunity or resistance to fight an infection is not that only one. So if that was so, with one dose and the booster shots, the 3 doses of polio and 1 dose, we wouldn't have that long an immunity. The smallpox, again, that long an immunity. So we need to understand that the immunity is humoral as well as cellular. And the cells, the T cells as they are called, within our body will be there. They have a memory. And once they are exposed to the virus, it may not be immediate, but there will be a time lag between the identification of the virus and the generation of antibodies. That is all that is there. But there will be a response that is better than an unexposed person, a susceptible person who is neither vaccinated or immunized. So therefore, the cellular immunity will also kick in. We're still understanding the nuances of it. So until we know that, we are hopeful, many of us are hopeful, we will not have that serious disease. We may have a mild disease. We may have a reinfection, yes, possible. Where we have a Delta variant, we may have an Omicron, yes, but not as bad as the other uninfected person. So not just cellular, not just humoral, but also cellular, but the whole dynamics of immunity is not clear. And we can't blame the scientists also for this. There's only disease is only 2 years old and vaccine is only 1 year old.
Right.
1 year old vaccine. We need to give time to understand. Until that, take precautions. So my goal would be in an equitable distribution of whatever we have, in a just and ethical manner of distribution of what we have. Goal will be, if the disease is there somewhere in the world, it can spread somewhere else. Therefore, goal should be immunize everyone as far as possible, especially those that have not had the disease, especially those that are vulnerable. That should be a target. Then you think of booster shots. And if you think of booster shots, probably the most at risk, maybe the healthcare workers or maybe the vulnerable or whatever. But not before that. But again, clearly study the adverse events before you make decisions, because a vaccine needs to have safety profile as the number one category of the safety. In all drug use, vaccines have to be the safest.
I think you have incidentally answered a friend's very agitated question, which I wanted to make the last one. He was lamenting about this whole policy on booster dose for senior citizen in India. And, why should they not take what he calls scientific wisdom in the US, UK, Israel, and Australia, who have recommended the booster dose. And India is saying we need to immunize everybody before we give the booster dose. So the ethical question, I'm a senior citizen, so I'm very anxious to get it. But there are another 40 crores, 50 crore people who need to get it, and only 3% have been immunized in Africa, which means I'm also at risk. So what is this whole, your thought on this booster dose?
So that ethical tension is always there in public health.
Right,
That ethical tension is always there, because if you have 10 people and you know that by sacrificing one man, you can save the 9 others, how will you choose? That's
right,
why should you sacrifice that man? If I am that man, I wouldn't want to be sacrificed. So
correct.
that's the clear understanding. I gave a harsh example of sacrifice because if 10 people could be saved, all of them could be saved, should be the guiding principle.
Right.
Everybody should be saved, should be the guiding principle. So that ethical principle of justice and equity is important in this, and therefore I think we should look at it from that perspective. India is absolutely lucky, and we have a robust system of manufacturing for vaccines and distributing vaccines, and we have had large number of people infected, also large number of people vaccinated.
Thank you. I think that answers. So
I'll answer that comment that is coming. Senior citizen could be left to be infected. No, that's not true. We know that. And let me share this with you. If you are vulnerable as a senior citizen, you have to take precautions. And I, for one, didn't stop going to the clinic even for a single day. I was in the hospital every day. And I, with just a mask, no other PPE, with just a mask and hand sanitizer, having examined personally COVID positive patients, seen them close quarters, children COVID positive screaming on my face with my mask on, have survived. So it is not that vaccine is the only measure. Of course, you have the vaccine, you get the vaccine, government does care, I would say, governments do care. But as a policy, public health policy, we look at to benefit the largest number. If you have the resources and you can get it done, please go ahead and get it done. No one is preventing you from that. So, but as a public health policy, if you want the governments to act for you, you have to first have an equitable distribution and then only look at the personal choices.
thank you, Dr. Matthews. It was a wonderful session, and thank you for handling our many questions so candidly. Not only it's very inspiring, not just educative, but inspiring. And we are certainly not disappointed this evening. Thank you so much. And it's just over 8 o'clock, and may now request Secretary Sri Subhash Chandra Bose to deliver the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Subbarao Garu. President of Foswell, Hyderabad, Sri Venkateswara Rao Garu. Distinguished Speaker, Dr. Matthew Varghese. Family and friends of Sri Pokara Nagendra Rao Garu. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining our 156th monthly meeting. We thank the family members of late Pokara Nagendra Rao Garu for establishing an annual endowment lecture in his name in the month of December. We also thank Sri Shiv Sharma Duvuri for the annual logistics sponsorship for the month of December every year in the name of his grandson, Master Valmiki Vishnu Vattipalli. Fortunately, pandemics do not descend on humanity more often than they do. The most recent one was the Spanish flu in 1918, over 100 years ago. Much has changed in the world since then. Not just the scientific knowledge, our lifestyles, our value systems, and ethics, but more importantly, the healthcare delivery systems. Yet practically no one living presently has a first-hand experience of the last pandemic, not even the governments. So it is not surprising that the world was gasping for breath, literally and figuratively, when COVID-19 struck. Many significant decisions had to be made at the individual level to the global level. There was no time to process them through the prism of scientific, ethical, or human rigor. That is the very nature of a pandemic, that it strikes without warning. And today's talk so elegantly brought out the various aspects we should ponder over in addition to those that are obvious. Thank you so very much, Dr. Matthews Varghese, for delivering such an informative and fascinating talk in such a lucid manner. We have experienced your famed humility this evening and feel privileged that you could spend an evening with us. Thank you again, and we truly appreciate your time. Thank you, Ms. Deekshita Kanumuri, for reading the prayer and for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Vivekananda, for introducing our distinguished speaker. You are the right person to do this, being an orthopedic surgeon yourself. We are very happy that the family members of late Pokar Nagendra Rao Garu could be a part of today's meeting to cherish his memory. Thank you, Mr. Prakash Rao Pokala, for joining us this evening from your morning in California, USA.
And also Sairam and Satya Pratap, two of his brothers.
And his siblings Sairam and Satya Pratap. We thank Mr. Prakash Rao for sharing some snippets of Pokar Nagendra Rao Garu's life and work. We propose to continue with these Zoom meetings till further notice. Omicron has cast a shadow on a world that was slowly healing. This makes it all the more important to continue to follow the basic preventive steps of wearing a mask, washing hands frequently, and not going out unless absolutely inevitable. I would especially caution against attending any gatherings, especially in the indoors, be it for weddings or for some other auspicious events, especially at our age. It is prudent to remain vigilant. Our forthcoming meetings are as follows. Saturday, 15th January 2022 at 6:15 p.m. Dr. Nageswar Reddy Duvur, Padma Vibhushan, Rudolf Schindler Awardee, Chairman AIG Hospitals, will speak to us on emerging global healthcare delivery models. In the month of February, on the 19th at 6:15 p.m., Sri Mahesh M. Bhagwat, IPS, Commissioner of Police, Rachakonda Commissionerate, will speak to us on the menace of human trafficking. Then, on the 19th March 2022 at 6:15 p.m., Dr. Jagdish Sheth, Professor of Marketing, University of Emory, Georgia, USA, will speak to us on the increasing central role of India in the world geostrategic order. With this 156th meeting, we have today completed 13 years of monthly meetings without a break of Foswell Hyderabad, and we look forward to many more milestones. On behalf of the President and Executive Committee members of Foswell India Hyderabad, I wish to sincerely thank each one of our members who gave us their unstinted support over the years, the generous donors who set up the endowments, and the logistics sponsorship donors. We are indebted to every single one of our very distinguished speakers who gave us their time so generously to spend an an evening with our members and share their experience and expertise. It is their sterling lectures on a variety of topics that have earned Fossil India Hyderabad the reputation for quality discourses that it has come to enjoy. We continue to be guided, inspired, and led in our journey to serve our senior citizens by our founder, President Sri Venkateswara Rao Garu, and all the EC members. We are grateful to each and every one of our stakeholders. On that happy note, good night, ladies and gentlemen, till we meet in the new year on the third Saturday of January the 15th for our 157th monthly meeting. Stay home and stay safe. Wish you all a very happy and healthier year in 2022. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much again, Dr. Verghese, and look forward to being in touch.
Thank you.
And thank you for spending the time with us. Good night, everybody. I'll now close the meeting.